KLC. Today we're going to be talking about what you need to know about borrowing and refinancing during an emergency. As elected officials, I do want to go ahead and say thank you for committing yourselves to an hour of your time. I know that each moment is precious, and here at KLC we do want to continue to acknowledge your commitment to both betterment of yourselves and your own community. Quickly before we begin, I want to take care of a few housekeeping items and do quick thank yous. The first, I want to thank the training team for their continued support of all these webinars as they quickly pivoted from standard operations to the new normal of virtual trainings. Not only have they been coordinating and managing all of these training sessions and webinar sessions, but they've also undertaken the transition of our ACE Summit to a completely virtual arena. I know that they are putting the final icing on the cake for next week when that launches Wednesday through Friday. So I think it's a big thank you for them being willing to divide their resources to continue to offer these trainings to our members. As for the housekeeping items, we're just going to talk about the format today. So we are scheduled for an hour long. We're going to divide that into two parts. The first part will be our panelist-led discussion. So we'll try to keep that about 45 minutes to allow us to have a nice 15-minute open question and answer session. More than likely, we won't be able to address every single question. However, we will be more than willing to convene offline to work with you individually to address any matters that were left hanging or if we weren't able to answer to a satisfactory level. I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists, but before I introduce our panelists, I also want to thank our moderator today, Mr. Chris Johnson from our Municipal Law Department. So not only is Chris a great resource to have on our webinar today, but he's a great resource here at the League. In my opinion, he has an encyclopedic knowledge of Kentucky law, and I often run down there and tap into the Encyclopedia Chris whenever I have a legal question. I know based off the number of phone calls that I receive on a daily basis, I'm glad that many of you are also leveraging him as a resource here at KLC. As for our panelists today, we have myself, which I completely forgot to introduce myself when I started. I'm Stephen Pekarsky here with the KLC, a municipal finance analyst. Along with myself, we have two other gentlemen today, Mr. Brian Skinner from Ross Sinclair & Advisors. Brian is the Vice President of Ross Sinclair & Advisors. Along with being the Vice President, he has served 13 years in a municipal advisory role for various cities, schools, and other local county governments. Ross Sinclair & Advisors is consistently ranked the #1 financial advisor in the state of Kentucky. Last year alone, RSA Advisors brought over $450 million to the market. Ross Sinclair & Advisors also serves as the lead or the financial advisor for the Kentucky Bond Corporation pool, and Brian serves as our lead analyst for that. In addition to Brian, we have Mr. Daniel Briscoe from Dinsmore Shoal. Dinsmore Shoal represents Kentucky League of Cities as our bond counsel for our Kentucky Bond Corporation municipal bond pool. Daniel is a proud graduate of Center College where he obtained his undergrad, and he further went on to Ohio State to obtain his JD and MBA. Daniel has been a part of such large and complex financings such as the Louisville Yum Center, the Lexington Rupp Arena, and he was also part of the state's ever largest refunding. I'm very proud to join these gentlemen today in discussing today's topic. And without any further ado, I will turn it over to Daniel. Daniel, you have control and you're ready to start sharing.
All right. Hey, everybody. I'm Daniel Briscoe. Thank you so much, Stephen, for the wonderful intro and then the opportunity to speak with you guys today. I am going to share my screen, which is I am an attorney. Also, I will say this is the first time I've worn a tie since March, and it's very exciting. But as an attorney, I'm not as slick with PowerPoint as our good friends at the League of Cities. So hopefully mine doesn't put everyone to sleep. If it doesn't, I'm sure the subject matter will. But 1 second, let me share my screen. I can. All right, well.
You can do it.
How are we looking?
It's beautiful.
It's just a tremendous maroon background. So I thought what I would do today is we have an emphasis on what are ways to borrow during an emergency. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that with some of the things that have been going on, the COVID-19 outbreak and different things that are stressing the finances of any governmental unit, cities, counties, the state, so on and so forth. These things are not stuff that we would normally encourage or whatever, but that might become necessary as financial situations change or there's a true emergency, whatever the case is. But to really talk about that, I wanted to at least just quickly go over some very basic borrowing that cities can do. And so this is going to sort of be like a 5 to 10 minute overview of the primary ways that a city would borrow. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what are some specific things to keep in mind when we're dealing with something like the coronavirus, which hopefully you won't have to deal with something like this ever again. But this type of emergency advice and analysis will unfortunately probably come up, in the future. So in any case, you have 6 basic ways that a city can borrow, and we're going to go through each one briefly in turn. The first and most basic is just a traditional bank financing. I'm sure many of you all have been involved in these things. I know from looking at the participant list that I've worked on a handful of these with some of you on this call. But this is maybe the simplest form of borrowing that a city can do. You work with the local bank or any bank really. These tend to work best for sometimes smaller projects, or they can be more relationship oriented. A lot of times you'll work with a local bank or whatever. And so if you've got a smaller project, oftentimes it makes sense to talk with them and work something out. Tends to have lower transaction costs because you're not preparing an offering document or anything like that, typically speaking. And so these are kind of your simple, most basic loans that a city will do. And probably some of you guys, or all of you all, have experience with these types of things, but got to start somewhere. So next, going up the ladder, is a traditional bond financing. Again, many of you all have seen these bonds or notes, which are effectively just bonds that mature in less than 5 years, fewer than 5 years. Bonds can be sold. You can work with a team of a financial advisor and a bond counsel to put together an offering document. Depending on how you structure it, you can place it with an individual bank, or you can bid it out. The benefit of doing a capital markets deal, which is what we call them when you're going out to the public market or something with the bond issue, is that you've got potentially lots of different bidders, and so you're able to get maybe a lower cost of capital. So for your bigger, more complicated projects that require some thought and are rate sensitive and things like that, a lot of times you go the bond route. And so those 2 things are sort of your basic steps. KBC, and this is part of the reason why I'm on this call today, the Kentucky League of Cities runs a program that some of you are probably familiar with, and some of you may not be. It is the Kentucky Bond Corporation, and it's a pool program. And so what happened, for those that don't know, is the League of Cities formed a corporation that can issue bonds on behalf of participant cities. So this allows the league to go out and work with a handful of different borrowers to let them borrow through the league's credit. The league is AA- rated for S&P, which is pretty good, and investment grade, and better than a lot of smaller entities and things like that. So it's sort of the same concept. It makes sense, right? People pool their money and they're able to get a better deal when they go in together. Some other benefits are that smaller projects, something that normally only a bank would do for a couple $100,000 or whatever, we're able to put into a pool, and using economies of scale, because we can get a handful of participants, we can get kind of capital market type rates for a smaller project than you would normally see. It's also just a flexible program. We're able to get to market quickly and things like that. So a lot of times, you know, especially for certain projects, smaller borrowers, the pool program can open doors that you may not have thought. You might have thought, well, this is just not enough money for anybody to fool with, or whatever the case is. And pool program gives you a lot more flexibility in areas to borrow than you might have traditionally been able to otherwise. And so then you have anticipatory borrowing, which I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on, but these are just any type of borrowings where a city is thinking in the next year or two it's going to receive some type of revenue. So a lot of times you'll see these done for tax purposes, where you have an outflow of cash that needs to happen and you've got an inflow of tax receipts throughout the year. And to match those up, you do a borrowing and pay it back over the years your taxes come in. Sometimes you know there's going to be a grant that's coming, and so you're going to repay the year or two note with that grant money. And then some of you all may be familiar with these used in an interim financing situation where the anticipated revenue, so to speak, is a bond issue that you do down the road once construction is completed. So anticipatory borrowings are a type of thing that can come up when you know that there is some revenue in the future that's coming in. In any case, those are just your basic sort of borrowing ways that commonly come up. There are two that I wanted to touch on quickly today because they're specifically relevant right now, just in the situation, the tumultuous times that we're dealing with, and particularly with the effects. And I know for a lot of cities and borrowers, period, we're still figuring out what exactly that means. But the COVID-19 pandemic is having an effect. And so you had a statewide emergency that was declared. A lot of cities and counties individually declared emergencies for various different reasons. And because we were in a lot of cases experiencing an emergency, or certainly one that would qualify for one that a city could so declare. But in any case, when you borrow in this path, if you're willing to declare a state of emergency, it makes sense, right? You gain a lot of additional flexibility. The city does. One, as some of you all know, and certainly your city attorneys do, when you're under a state of emergency, your resolution, publishing, all these different things are a little bit relaxed. You can declare meetings easier. You can get things done a little bit faster. The idea being that we're willing to suspend some of the sort of due process citizen protections that we have to enable a city to accurately respond to a serious situation, emergency. As far as borrowing concerns, what you need to know is the Kentucky Constitution and state law, and I'm sure you guys have run up against these, prescribed limits to the amount of money that a city can borrow, okay? And they're based on the size of the city and the total assessed value of the city, and it sets a limit that many of you all are probably familiar with, where you can't borrow beyond that amount. Most cities, not most cities, but a lot of cities aren't anywhere near their limit. Some are, you know, it just depends. But what's important to remember is if you're in an emergency situation, a true emergency where your municipality has declared a state of an emergency, you can, if structured correctly, exceed your debt limits. So if there's something very, very serious that you need to borrow for, and it has to be for providing a public service, you can't just do it because you want money. But if there's something legitimate that needs to happen, and you would have to exceed your debt limit in order to do it, but there exists a situation that could be considered an emergency, like the coronavirus pandemic, you can declare an emergency and potentially exceed your debt limits in order to get a critical project done, which is helpful to know at a time like this. The last kind of exotic type of financing I want to touch on, but that might become more and more relevant over the next year or two, depending on the financial effects of everything as they shake out, is what's called a floating indebtedness financing. These are uncommon. I suspect probably very few of you all have ever been involved in one, but what it is, and you can do this through the budgetary process, in the event that there is a unfortunate, it is unfortunate, but an unforeseen circumstance or event, for example, a pandemic, causes the city to have a structural imbalance. And we could talk offline about what that means. You got to document that your expenses exceeded your revenues dramatically based on something you weren't expecting, okay? And then that wedge, that money, that shortfall that has come because of this unfortunate circumstance is called a floating indebtedness, and you can finance that. You can also, this doesn't, in an emergency, you can exceed the debt limits. In this situation, it'd be better considered a financing that is issued to fund a floating indebtedness, meaning a structural imbalance in your budget, doesn't count against your debt limit the same way that like a revenue supported lease or something like that wouldn't. So it gives you some flexibility, again, to if you're up against your limit or you're concerned about that, or you don't want to add on debt generally that counts towards your limit, but you've got a revenue shortfall that you need to address. Floating indebtedness is like a rare tool in your toolkit, but you never know when it may become beneficial. And so I think mostly the things I wanted to tell you all today were just generally to refresh everyone's memory of the different ways that y'all can borrow, to point out that a lot of times, frankly speaking, it's not worth the expense to go through a full-blown bond issuance, and so KBC can be a resource there to make it, more affordable, a better deal for the cities to access the capital markets that way. But then also I wanted to bring your attention to a couple of these emergency type borrowings that, God forbid anybody needs, or that there's actually a situation where, we have cities that are being pushed to the limits financially. It could be helpful to know what these tools are. That said, and I wouldn't be a lawyer if I didn't give y'all some gigantic caveat. There's no one size fits all structure, right? There are as many different ways to do these deals as there are cities and counties in Kentucky. So the best bet is always call up Stephen, call up the league, call up your financial advisor, your bond counsel, tell them what the issue is. The more detail we have, the better. And we can structure something that works for you, whether your goals are the term, your goals are your rate, your goals are getting money now, defending against an emergency, whatever the case is, there's usually some type of structure that will work, and we can get you the money that you need. So in any case, I'm sure you all are super thrilled to have an attorney talk at you for 15 minutes. So I'm going to stop, and I'm going to turn it over to someone less, hopefully, threatening.
Thank you, Daniel. This is Brian Skinner, RSA Advisors. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Let's see if I can figure that out. Does everybody see that? You see that, Daniel?
You did way better than I did.
Hey, I'm pretty proud of myself. This is the first time also I've worn a tie for a while, so I put it on about 2 minutes before this when I realized that Daniel had one on. I will apologize to Stephen. We left him in the dark a little bit on our group text, and he missed the tie memo. That's mostly my bad, but I'm gonna blame Daniel a little bit. So what I'm gonna go over are just a few options for financing. Like Daniel said, there's no one size fits all. So I'm just gonna give you a couple brief examples. If something kind of sounds like something you'd be interested in, call Stephen, call your financial advisor, it's hopefully us, call your bond counsel, it's hopefully Daniel, and we will we'll get you through this and figure out a solution that works best for you. Just that first page, some contact information. If you don't have it, you can Google us or search through your email where we bothered you at some point in the past. I will get some housekeeping out of the way. You'll see our name is now RSA Advisors. Not Ross Sinclair and Associates. We have spun off. We're now an independent municipal advisory firm, meaning, unfortunately, I can't handle your retirement account anymore, which I didn't do anyway, but same people, same office, same email, same phone. So nothing should change. Just our logo is about the only thing you'll notice. So without further ado, let's get to it. There we go. So the short-term borrowing may be something that you've heard about or thought about. Daniel touched on this a little bit. Some people call them a TAN or TRAN, tax revenue anticipation notes. These used to be done a lot more when short-term interest rates were high. So basically what happens is you have a cash flow problem. And so sometime during the year, you're going to be low on cash or negative on cash, and you need to borrow some money. These are borrowed and paid back within the same fiscal year. So for something like the COVID-19 crisis, this may not help you. Maybe it will, but paying back within 1 year can sometimes be a little prohibitive for that. It's used to, like I show here, remedy a cash flow deficiency, not really for long-term purposes or anything. Just, hey, we've got a month where, you know, our taxes don't come in until December, January, but in August, we're going to have some trouble making ends meet. A lot of times what people used to do and still do, tax anticipation notes are not done very much in Kentucky anymore, is you go ahead and say you borrow on July 1, invest those funds at your local bank or get some sort of investment product, and it's invested and offsets the cost of that interest rate. So say you borrow for 2%, you're able to maybe invest at 1%. Unfortunately, short-term investment rates have gone down quite a bit, so there's not much help there. The next thing we'll talk about is the multi-year borrowing. Like Daniel said, if you declare a state of emergency, you may be able to borrow for several years. And that's kind of where a lot of this may help for the COVID-19 issues. If you can't pay it back within the same fiscal year, we'll let you pay it back over a certain number of years. We'll have to work with Daniel, and every situation's different to determine how long your payback can be, kind of determine what you want it to be. Maybe this time you weren't really planning on borrowing. Maybe you're going to buy some police cars, or you're going to do something, a capital project with cash. You may want to now think about borrowing that money. It's that way you have the cash on hand. So you'll maybe adjust your budget just a little bit to take advantage of, honestly, some historically low interest rates. And if I don't put you to sleep or run out of my allotted time, we'll talk about interest rates here at the end. So here's just a few scenarios showing some short-term borrowing. I call it short-term. 10 years, I realize, is not exactly short-term, but in Kentucky, you can borrow up to about 40 years. So short-term in relative term here. So you see that first year, that's a 1 year. That would be, I don't know if you all can see my mouse, but if you can, it's the 1 year. You'll see that our NIC, estimated NIC, that's net interest cost. That is basically the interest rate and the underwriter's discount, the person that buys it. A lot of times for a TAN, it would be a bank. So that's what we're estimating a 1 year rate would be. And then your all-inclusive cost of 3.54%. That is all of the upfront costs. That's my fee, legal fees, all the fees, underwriter's fees, put into one single rate for you. So as you can see, if you borrowed in fiscal year 2021, say you got the money July 1 of 2020, you would have to pay that back within the fiscal year. I mean, it could be June 30th of 2021, but it'd be paid back in one fiscal year. The 5-year borrowing is the next one. As you can see, that net interest cost is a little higher at 2.4%, but the all-inclusive cost is actually a little bit lower, and that's just a factor of you're spreading those costs out over several years. What we can do, and like Daniel said, every situation is different, but that first year, I'm showing that you pay back no principal. Then you really just pay back over the next 4 years. Of course, that can be staggered. We can pay some principal in 2021 if you think you can. I've just solved it to be level. So that first fiscal year, you'd be in it for fees and interest of $9,000, borrowing $1 million. Of course, you got to look down at the bottom right there. The total cost of borrowing $1 million and paying it out over 5 years would be about $60,000 in interest and fees. The far right column here, is a 10-year deal. Same exact thing. Net interest cost is slightly higher, not much higher at all, really, due to our yield curve being flat. I realize I'm getting in the weeds a little bit there. but borrowing $1 million for 10 years would cost you somewhere around $133,000 is what we're estimating. As always, subject to change. All of these deals we would do would be a competitive bid. These are all assuming you use KBC. Those are competitively bid. So, we don't know what the interest rate will be. We've got a KBC deal selling in a week. Honestly, I expect rates to be lower than what I'm showing here, but as low as rates are, we can only assume that they're going to go up from here. So move on to the next little bit. Next little bit's like, well, we don't really want to take on any money. We just want to maybe take care of what we already have. Let's make sure we have the lowest rates possible. So the next thing you might want to look at is a refinance, or in this case, we'll call it a restructure. Generally, a refinance is completed to achieve debt service savings, structure changes. There could be cash flow management issues. Sometimes you're doing a new project. You want to combine it all together to have one level payment or something like that. So you have to, have the desire to do one of those, a high enough interest rate that it makes sense to refinance. If you don't have necessarily a high interest rate and we're not able to save you money based on interest savings, you may have other reasons like that, structure changes, or in this case, you need to come up with cash that you don't necessarily want to be paying debt service in the next couple of years. So we would be shifting that. So the considerations are the ability to prepay. If you've done, a bank financing, a traditional financing through KBC, most of them have something called a call feature or a call date. You can't pay it off. You can't refinance it until a certain date and time. So call Steven, call us. If you're not sure what that is, a lot of times we can figure that out for you to let you know if it's callable or not. If you've got a large bond issue that's outstanding right now, or a KBC issue that's outstanding right now and it's already refinanceable, we've probably already reached out to you. But it doesn't hurt to always check to see if we can take a look through your audit and see if we can find something. So we were discussing between us the other day, if say you borrowed for a certain asset, there are certain useful life rules. You can't borrow for a fire truck for 40 years. It's just not going to last that long. Unfortunately, there probably are quite a few cities that still have some pretty old fire trucks in use. But it's tough to borrow for something like that. Also, if you've only got a couple years left on your loan, it may not make a lot of financial sense to extend that out. But circumstances are certainly different these days, so it may be beneficial. So the next slide, I'm just going to show the two examples of what a traditional refinance are and what we consider a restructure. So we're just assuming that you've got an existing 4% loan at $2 million level debt service. This is just a random example. And so if we were to refinance that today, we think our new all-inclusive cost would be about 3.12%. As you can see, it goes out 10 years. We have the fiscal year on the left, the prior debt service is what you're currently paying, and then the new debt service. And then the far right just subtracts those two and shows you what your savings are. So annually, you'd be saving somewhere between $6,000 and $11,000. So, a big help overall, and it makes sense to do that. However, during COVID-19, if you're looking for cash, that savings of $8,000 on a $2 million deal, it may not move the needle very much for you. So then we look at something like a restructure over on the right. So as you can see, we're showing the same 4%, $2 million deal, prior debt service there on the left. But we know that in fiscal year 2021, we're going to need some more cash. It's going to free up some stuff. So right now, I'm showing that we basically don't pay any principal. I know I didn't break it out here to be a little simpler, but not paying much principal in fiscal 2021 or much in 2022. So as you can see, the savings on the right in red, I believe it's red, is $222,000. That moves the needle quite a bit more than that $8,000. And then you'll see the next year. I've just randomly structured it. You know, every deal's different. We'll go through an infinite number of scenarios for you to try to meet your budget needs. And then we've tacked those on essentially to the last year. As a legal caveat for Daniel, we will have to look at a few things to make sure we're able to extend the term, the useful life, like we mentioned before, but that's a problem for Daniel to figure out, not us. We'll just go ahead and make promises. So you'll see it costs a little bit. We've got some negative savings those last 2 years, but when you add all those up, it ends up being about a break even. Of course, I made this example for this presentation, so in real life, it's not gonna be that perfectly close to a break even. Depending on the structure, you may save some money. It may cost you quite a bit of money, depending on if your old loan that you're wanting to restructure is only at 3%, and we're not really lowering the interest rates. That's going to cost you money to extend it, but it might be worth it to get the city through some tough times. So that's pretty much all my time. I know I'm showing some great interest rates here. We can talk about that more in the Q&A section. So I'll just leave this screen up. As you can see briefly, Stephen, I promise I'll give it to you in just a second. Interest rates are incredibly low. You see this little spike for the COVID crisis. Rates got pretty crazy for a couple weeks, and now we're back down to about historical lows. So with a little bit of good news for you, I'll hand it off to Stephen, and hope everyone's still awake, or at least a couple people.
Thank you, Brian. I also wanted to quickly address one housekeeping matter that I did not take care of on the forefront, the question and answer function of Zoom. I know that Lori had just submitted a question. If you have questions as they arise throughout the presentation, please use that as kind of a repository so we can address those as they're made available. We'll probably reserve most of those questions till the tail end of the overall presentation, but I wanted to ensure that you all knew about that function and we would be monitoring as we go forward. Obviously, I want to go ahead and introduce the entirety of our KLC finance staff. I'm just not a sole operator. I am supported by Robin Miller, our Director of Corporate Law and Finance. Much like many of you, she is currently in the final stages of finalizing our annual budget. She wishes that she could attend today to meet and greet and provide information. However, she just had other obligations that she had to address today. She's a great resource. She's been here for over 20 years. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with Robin and all the added benefits that she can offer to you. She did want me to say that if you have any questions or anything that you should need, she's always available via phone call, email, what have you. And then there's obviously myself. You can use my picture in case you have any type of pest infestation. It's a great deterrent. My role as municipal finance analyst is really, to simplify it down, it is to be compliant and to ensure accuracy. So my job is to monitor everything from the beginning stages to all the way to the very end when those loans may mature, or if we're doing any type of payoff, to ensure that everything that you want done is done to a T. With what Brian has provided to you and what Daniel has provided, I want to kind of highlight how KLC can take you from what you're allowed to do and what it would look like to how you actually can do that via KLC or from our services or offerings. So as Daniel kind of addressed and as Brian addressed, we can only help when we're made aware of the issues. For the past almost two years, KLC has been a little proactive by just digging through as many city audits as possible to say, where can we help cities save money? However, that's only one layer of assistance that we can offer, because that is the only thing that we can identify from an audit presentation. We're not aware if there's a cash crunch or if there's some restrictive covenant that's attached to an existing debt obligation. So if you know that you're starting to feel some sort of pressure, whether that just be related to pure finances or the desire to move out of some existing relationship, let KLC know that we can see what we can do to help. I can't promise that we're going to be a golden ticket to get you out of every situation, but at least give us an opportunity to try. Now, after we're made aware of the situations, it goes back to this entire split. Should we be looking at a short-term, or should we be looking at long-term financial solutions, or is there some sort of overlap that it could be a mixture of both? Obviously, we with our team, both including Dinsmore and RSA advisors, along with your staff, would want to have these detailed discussions to say, what is the root cause? What is the expected solution? What makes you comfortable and able to lay your head down at night? I know city officials, there's gonna be a lot of other things that are spinning through your brain that are still probably gonna allow you to not get a whole lot of sleep, but at least allow us to give you maybe a few extra minutes. No matter which solution that we look at, we do have to continue to stress the alignment with the Kentucky Revised Statutes. Obviously, with short-term, we're looking at a subchapter of chapter 65 and 66 for long-term. But on top of those, we've also kind of hit you over the head with there's the tax consequences and the tax liability, both on the state and federal level. And that is the benefit that we need to leverage our resources at Dinsmore to say, here's our situation, here's our proposed solution. Are we within the confines of the law? Because the last thing that we ever want to do is say that we're going to promise you a solution and then have to come back and retrace our steps. To get into what it would look like for a short-term borrowing from KLC, we need to talk about what's going to be the minimum building blocks to get you off the ground. And that's going to be what is a potential lender going to want to see as financial information. The industry standard across pretty much any borrowing is going to be 3 years of annual audits. So they need to see consistent financial data to determine if there are any oddities that they would be concerned about adding you to their portfolio, because this is still a business decision for them as much as it is a need for you. Along with annual audits, within a short-term borrowing situation, there's going to be an obligation to provide a cash flow analysis, minimum up to 12 months. Obviously, we can go further depending upon what's going to be the targeted structure, but that cash flow analysis, it can be as top line as going a month by month analysis to say, here's our expected revenues against our expected expenses. With any type of financial forecast, it's always going to be prudent to say, if you have detailed financial information, it is beneficial to include it, because at some point in time, you may need to revisit and say, how did we do a cash flow analysis? And if you have accurate and detailed information, it can help be a template going forward. And additionally, the more detail that you provide, the more confident and the more accurate that representation will be to any type of potential lender. So once you've got kind of those two base steps, you need to start to consider what is going to be this backbone of a pledge, contract, or lien. Obviously, Daniel alluded that there are pledges of future tax proceeds, future revenue proceeds. You can be looking at bond anticipation notes, or you could be looking at some combination thereof. There are limitations that say, well, you just can't go ahead and say, we're planning on bringing in $2 million and you've never brought in $2 million on tax receipts. They're going to cap it at 75% of the estimated, 75% of the previous known value. So there are restrictions, and any type of determination of pledge or determination of value will have to be certified by some elected official within 30 days of the authorizing resolution to move you forward. So we've got the foundation set up as to what you should be expected to bring to a table. Now we need to go look and say, what is KLC or our partners going to do on your behalf? So we're going to look at leveraging our entire network of our financial partners. If there is a situation where you're concerned about the political interpretations of submitting something out for a bid, especially if you have a very active local bank, we all know that it's very difficult to say no to a friend. However, if your friend says, I'm going to do it for 2 times the cost, it's difficult to assume the additional costs associated with that. But RSA Advisors, as an independent provider, can look at the entire scenario to say, well, here's the full spectrum of bids from low cost to high cost, and it's still going to be up to your determination as to which is the most appropriate solution for you today. Now, if you find a partner that you want to dance with, you can get into having Dinsmore, if asked, can prepare all the necessary resolutions and legal documents to ensure absolute compliance under the law. So if you've done everything, you found a partner, you've agreed to everything, and now you own some type of new financial obligation, you as the borrower will then be responsible for managing the relationship. So KLC does not have a direct product offering at this point in time where KLC is issuing on behalf of you in a short-term capacity. We still have that all functions under a long-term borrowing arena. We submitted a financial survey to determine if there was significant need, and I'm happy to say that we assumed the worst, and our responses came back saying that everyone right now feels strong and stable. However, if we need to revisit and look at some type of short-term borrowing, we can make that pivot and begin to address that lack of offering. But at the present moment, it would be a outside service provider. On the flip side, looking at a quote-unquote long-term borrowing, we still need to talk about the same financial foundation. It's, again, 3 years of audits, industry standard. Along with that, KLC, KBC, and KBC have an application, 2-page simple application that we use based off whatever pledge is being provided. So if it's a general obligation pledge, we're going to use your taxable base information to interpret what is the allowable debt capacity that Daniel had alluded to in his presentation. Or if you're looking at a pure revenue transaction, think of like your water and sewer departments. So if you have user fees associated with that, we need to ensure that those fees and those customer accounts are sufficient to service the annual debt. So there are covenants in place for any type of revenue transaction. We have started to move towards looking at a debt profile for any borrower or potential borrower, especially as we focus on refinance and restructures. This debt profile gives us a more holistic view of what you have outstanding, what may be these certain covenants in place, what are the call dates. That just allows us to say, yeah, we may have identified one area that is a problem, but are there other options that are available that we can kind of roll up into a singular package to either limit the number of bank accounts, limit the number of capital restrictions, or any type of pre-existing covenant by doing a refinance or restructure. Brian did reference the scenario development. So that is a vital key for any type of potential long-term borrowing, is saying, what's it expected to cost, both on an annual basis and as a long-term full maturity. So RSA Advisors, as he's mentioned, everything's done via the competitive market. So we don't dictate terms. It can be to our benefit and to our detriment, depending upon where the interest rates go on a day-to-day basis. We can run various amortization schedules, both for time frame, for annual debt service amount, or for total dollar value. So if you're wanting to say, what does it look like over years, we can run the full gamut from 5 to 40 years. That's allowable currently per Kentucky law. Or if you want to say, I want to keep all my payments level at $100,000 every single year, you can say, well, if you do $100,000 over 20 years, what does that allow you to go for a project? Or lastly, if you just say, I know I don't want to spend more than $4 million over the entire life, we can provide all those different scenarios. And KLC offers their financings up to a complete 100%. So you can go to market and have the proceeds with minimal out-of-pocket expenses. There are going to be some publication expenses, but for making a publication to receive a few $1 million, it's a drop in the bucket. And once we have those scenarios, knowing that these are complex products and municipal bonds are not everyone's specialty, KLC and RSA advisors are more than willing to come meet with your specific functional groups, leadership groups, or your city officials in their entirety to discuss and make sure that you're 100% comfortable and confident with whatever product you may choose to go forward with. And if we make that commitment, it's a quick pivot into the legislative phase. So what are you going to be required to do as a official convened body? So Dinsmore Shoal will provide all the documents to you prior in advance of the meeting, so that you can review, your city attorney can review a lot of these products. They're all standard boilerplate, but we want to make sure that, again, you are comfortable and confident with what you're joining into. So if after we do the review, we get into what's the time commitment from a city side. So if you're doing a revenue deal, we can have everything wrapped up legislatively within one meeting. If we're doing a general obligation, because it is an ordinance, we do require 2 readings, but that can be 2 regular call, 2 special call, or any combination thereof. As we move into, so we passed all the legislative documents, what we're going to do there is, because you have now allowed KLC to act on your behalf to issue bonds via the Kentucky Bond Corporation, we have that targeted sale date that by we I mean RSA goes to market and has your package deal, whether that's just you as a single issue, or if it's that pooled entity. We take the entire package to market, put it up for sale. We take the lowest cost provider and look and say, well, if we're doing a refinance, we've obviously told you we're targeting a dollar amount to save. Brian's favorite saying that he's used over and over as we've been on the road many times since 2 years ago is, what happens if we said we're going to save you $200,000. We go to a sale date, all of a sudden interest rates spike. You are not bound by any level to say, well, we targeted 200,000, but you're now only saving 100,000, or if you're only saving 50,000. We can punt and move back. Obviously, you're currently paying that debt structure, and you have it budgeted per the requirements. So we can pivot and wait for an opportunity that presents itself for us to provide those presented savings. So we make a sale, and we're moving into the lease execution phase, which is just, again, Dinsmore Shoal will provide all the documents to you associated with the lease agreement. The number one item that I'd like to highlight is we're going to show you the whole monthly payment schedule for the entirety of that loan. And that payment schedule is fixed. It will not change unless some action from your side, whether that's going to be optional prepayment or if that's going to be a potential default or mispayment. So the only time that could ever move is by action from your side. So KLC, a bondholder, nobody else can say we're going to change the rate, or if it's going to move based off a variable product. No, this is fixed long-term offerings. And additionally, if we are looking at a refinance, so you have existing debt that needs to be paid off, we're going to manage all of that activity on your behalf to ensure that those checks, wires, ACH, all those matters are handled directly at closing. So you have a clean break from your previous relationship. So then we move quickly into our continued support function, which if we're talking a new money project rather than a refinance, there may be some sort of construction and/or project account. We can act as a disbursement agent, where you would be submitting disbursements to KLC. We review and ensure that all documents align with the expectations and submit those via wire or check. Or if you go back to say, well, we would prefer to have those funds maintained at a local banking institution, we're more than happy to move those entire proceeds to that institution at closing. I will say there's one caveat. all of these bonds are typically issued as a tax exempt issuance. So there is a arbitrage consideration that needs to be taken into account. Arbitrage is just a fancy way for the government to say, don't try to earn money on your tax exempt. They give you a grace period for construction to say, well, up to about 3 years, you can earn proceeds, but after that, it gets into you may owe the federal government tax proceeds. That's something we can talk on a more individual basis. We don't typically see constructions exceed a 2-year window, so we are usually fine on that front. But as my wife would say, nothing's 100% certainty. We want to make sure that we're covered either way. On top of being a disbursement agent, will also be an additional set of eyes. So we can be a maintenance provider to ensure that all the ACH information is accurate. Any type of activity, whether monthly or the semi-annual payment basis, is done as expected. And if not, we act quickly on your behalf to remedy with the trustee who's initiating those transactions. And the big item that KLC offers is acting as your disclosure agent. So there are up to 16 different events that the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, and the MSRB, the Municipal Security Rulemaking Board, has identified as requirements to be disclosed for any holder of municipal debt. So we monitor on your behalf and ensure that your compliance is up to date. With that compliance aspect, we're also looking at an obligation that you have to do on an annual basis. This is the only thing outside of ensuring that the monies are available on that monthly ACH basis is the submission of your annual audit. It's relatively minor, but it's just one thing that we need to ensure that you're providing accurate and timely financial information to any holder of debt. I think I went super fast, but that's good because that allows us to quickly open up our topic for a Q&A session, which I'm sure that's more of your all's desire than have us talk to you. So let us work together and address any questions that you may have at the present moment.
And I would like to just kind of touch on and kind of piggyback on something Daniel said as we're waiting on some of the questions to roll in, because I could smell the smoke and I could kind of hear the wheels spinning with some of y'all, because there's no question right now we are in an emergency with COVID-19, and Daniel's absolutely right that there are allowances in an emergency situation that cities can avail themselves of for passing ordinances and a lot of things like that. Once we get past this, and we are going to get past this, it's sort of my job, once Pee Wee's secret word of the day, emergency, is used, to kind of come in and talk a little bit about that, is because an emergency, as a lot of legal terms under statute in the state of Kentucky, has a very specific meaning. And an emergency, for at least for municipalities, is defined to be just that. And I get laughed at because my coworkers here heard me one time compare it to Godzilla on roller skates coming down Main Street. That is an emergency. It's not, and there's a case law. There's a case that states that it's not an exigency. It's not an inconvenience. It's not that your city attorney forgot to do something. It's got to be something that there's going to be a very real impending bad scenario for your city that comes up. So, and that's not to say that there's not going to be some issue like that. But as far as the day-to-day operations, and I've seen cities that kind of get a little in the habit of stating, well, it's Tuesday, we're going to declare an emergency. That's if you're going to do that, you need to work with your city attorney and bond counsel or whoever you're working with to make sure that you've got the field prepared to where you can make the showing as to what these emergency circumstances are. And having said that, I'm going to shut up now.
Thank you, Chris. So we've had 2 questions that have been posed currently. The first one is going to be probably directed or best answered by Mr. Skinner. So Lori Young had asked, is there a net interest saving threshold that you recommend before a city considers refinancing?
Yeah, can you hear me on there?
Yes.
a little difficulty here. I'm an amateur at this. Yeah, typically, we'd like to say somewhere between 4 and 5% would be a net present value savings. That equates to, if you have a loan that's somewhere in the 3.5 or above range, we may be able to make that work depending on the term and structure. For sure, if you had something that's at 4% or higher, it would probably make sense to refinance now. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when we get into the financial proposals, we do provide a individual packet for each city, and it'll identify those net present values. So that's a better presentation format of that. Additionally, we had another question asked: if long-term bonds are issued through KLC, is KLC's S&P rating and or the city's rating considered in the offering?
I'll answer this also. So right now, the KBC, which is the KLC's competitive bond sale pool, has a AA- credit rating. That's the credit rating that goes out to market. So to get that rating, it's a process that involves S&P, Standard & Poor's, reviewing all the underlying cities' credits, the cash flows of the pool. One reason that KBC has such a great rating is the league actually put in quite a bit of money, I believe around $5 million to fund what we call a debt service reserve fund. So that greatly enhances the look, the appearance of the pool to S&P, and helps us achieve that AA-. There's no guarantee that we'll stay at that. We're always hoping to get an upgrade, but you just never know. So right now, yeah, if you go out to market, it is based on the AA- of the pool.
And this may have been touched on already, so I apologize if it was and I just missed it. But we might do a KBC long-term bond deal for 30 years or whatever it is, but the underlying participants can borrow whatever their needs are. So if you have like a 10-year need or 20-year, whatever, we can fold it in. We just make Brian do a bunch more work and chop it up for each person. So you get the benefits of the bond program in the sense that you're availing yourself to its rating and its rate, but because of the way pools are set up, we're able to customize it for each individual participants, whatever their particular needs are.
And it's also probably worthwhile to add right there, any type of borrower within a bond pool is not subject to the risk of city XYZ. So if they have an issue in city of XYZ, you are not bound to any type of downstream ramifications. So your deal is independent of the other borrowers within each of the pools. I believe that, and do we have any additional questions?
Lori, you got anything for us?
I don't know if Brian, if 2 minutes would be sufficient to do a quick update on where the market is today.
Well, I'm currently, if you can hear me, Zoom is not responding, so hopefully you can still hear me. So I don't think I'm able to show my PowerPoint, but right now I'll just kind of explain it to you. Interest rates are incredibly low and pretty much historically low. Like I said, a couple weeks during the COVID crisis, interest rates skyrocketed, and it wouldn't have been the perfect time to borrow. Not ever saying that someone should borrow, but if you were to right now, it's pretty much we're at the historical lows. No guarantees they'll stay here, and every meeting I've been to for the past year, I've told everyone that rates can only go up from here since we're at probably 30-year lows, and I'm looking like a fool now because rates have stayed pretty darn low. So
I'm not a financial advisor, so I'm not qualified to give this advice, but I've been practicing law now for 7 years, and every day they've been saying rates are going to go up for 7 years.
Yeah. It's strange times we're living in now. When the stock market is up, in theory, interest rates should be going up also, and they are not. So just nothing, no times like you would ever find in a textbook right now. I think that's
It's
pretty
helpful
much.
to have the unmute button on. So I will just quickly wrap it up. Again, thank you all for your attendance today. Thank you for not only attending this webinar today, but all the prior and future webinars that KLC has been offering. We hope that you found benefit in the subject matter. If there are any type of questions or items we didn't address today, please feel free to contact any of us. We are more than willing to lend an ear to see what we can and can't do for you. But again, as I said, and we've all kind of hinted at, we can only address what we know of. So please keep the communications open and free flowing, and continue all the great work that you're doing for each of your constituents. And as Daniel and his kitten say goodbye, we will also bid goodbye. Have a great day, everyone. Enjoy.